Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Civil War Roundtable. The Union League Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. Over the last year, we've provided almost 100 separate programs on the Civil War, on the Constitution, liberty, public affairs programs on everything from COVID to policies on taxes and immigration and everything in between. We've had great success over the last year, and almost all of this has been virtual. I am excited to inform you that tonight's program, it is our hope anyhow, tonight's program will be the last all virtual program. That from here on out, we will have our programs in person here at the beautiful Union League of Philadelphia, as well as virtually. So our next program on June 9th, which will be about education in America, will be here at the Union League. So if you want to come to that program in town, we hope you will, please sign up now, because we are likely to have limited, at least for this first program, limited availability for in-person attendance. Again, all of our programs will continue to be streamed virtually as well. All of this programming is made possible through the generous contributions of League members and others that share our values, and I want to thank all of our members and others for contributing so generously over the past year. Tonight's program, it will be about an hour long, and towards the end, maybe 40 minutes in, there will be a Q&A function. There'll be a question and answer portion. You may ask questions at any time during the course of the program by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and our speaker will get to as many of those questions as he possibly can. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the historian of the Union League Legacy Foundation, Professor James Mundy. Jim.
Well, Your Lordship, thank you very much. And what the heck? One of I think the best parts of working at the League is that you get to meet a lot of great people. And I guess Robert, I think I've known you, about 20, 25 years at least. It feels that way, if not even a little longer, perhaps. So Robert's one of the great guys in Philadelphia Civil War medical history, and that's his specialty. And we've worked with Robert at the League for years and years and years, and all kinds of good stuff. So he's one of the all-time good guys, plying the Civil War trade, if you will. So really happy to have you here, Robert. Thank you very much. So let me read a little bit about something about Robert himself. So Robert Hicks Phd is Senior Consulting Scholar and William Maul Measy Chair for the History of Medicine of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. For over a decade, he served as director of the Mutter Museum and Historical Medical Library at the college. He has worked with museum-based education and exhibits for over 3 decades, primarily as a consultant to historic sites and museums. Robert has a doctorate in maritime history from the University of Exeter. Who would have thought? You never know. I think that's great. And degrees in anthropology and archaeology from University of Arizona. He also served as a naval officer with the U.S. Naval Security Group and found time to have a career in law enforcement. His most recent book, Civil War Medicine, A Surgeon's Experience, was published in 2019 by Indiana University Press, and you can take it out of the Union League Library, where we have a copy. So it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce, as I say, one of the all-time good guys in the Civil War field, Dr. Robert Hicks.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And thank you both, Jim and John, for inviting me to participate in this presentation. And I guess it's my first official one for the Legacy Foundation. So I'm very pleased about that. And thank you, everybody else. Joe, do we have my PowerPoint on the screen at this point? Or do I need to do a share screen on it? Here we go. All right, there we are. Do you see the vaccination pure and spurious on the screen at this point?
It is on the screen. You're good to go.
Okay, good. I wasn't sure about that. All right. Well, as if living through COVID isn't enough to satisfy your pandemic appetite, here's a bit more, and from a corner of the Civil War that I suspect that you may not have heard about. the vaccination crisis that the Confederacy experienced in the Civil War. You see at far right a photograph of a child with smallpox, fortunately a disease we don't see anymore. And I should point out that smallpox is eradicated from the planet, and we hope, but there's some exciting moments about smallpox coming up in this presentation. There are, to my knowledge, no photographs that survive of any person, soldier, civilian, from the Civil War, during the Civil War, with smallpox. But we know about the smallpox problem in the Confederacy and throughout the country generally through abundant written accounts. Just know that the photographs that I show you here are all post-Civil War, except for the clearly identifiable Civil War photographs of other things going on. I am representing the Mutter Museum tonight, although I am quasi-retired from that organization. Birthplace of American Medicine is a registered trademark. And at the moment, we have an exhibition called Spit Spreads Death. See a few images from it here that looks at the Philadelphia experience with the flu pandemic of 1918-1919. This is going to be up for several years. So if you still haven't had enough of pandemics, definitely come and see this. The museum is about to open to 7 days a week from about 5 days a week, which I think it operates under now with limited audiences every day, as many other museums in town are opening. Now, this may be a familiar set of pictures for you. At the end of the war, the most notorious war crimes trial took place of Captain Henry Wirtz, who was the commandant of the Andersonville prisoner of war camp in Georgia. And the image on the left is one of the, as you can see here, extremely happy Union soldiers to be freed from that camp. But it's photographs like this that really shock the public imagination. Many of you are undoubtedly very familiar with this war crimes trial, but there's a peculiar aspect to it. Of the charges brought forth to ultimately convict Henry Wirtz, and of course he was executed, was a charge of impure, poisoned vaccinations. Now at this time, smallpox was the only disease that one could be vaccinated against. And it's interesting that he was charged with either allowing or giving an order to have Union soldiers vaccinated with impure or poisoned vaccine. The term spurious vaccination also enters this picture. So very curiously, how did this get into the mix of things lodged against Captain Wirtz? And why was this in the military consciousness? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at. Shortly after the Battle of Antietam, in fact, very shortly after, as Robert E. Lee's forces were leaving the area, smallpox cases were showing up among the ranks. This became a trend and a persistent problem for the Confederacy throughout the war. In fact, into the next year, 1863, Richmond, Virginia, the Confederacy capital, was hit with a massive outbreak of smallpox. One Confederate surgeon by the name of Bolton was given the assignment to vaccinate all Confederate government employees as quickly as possible. And the local press described the city as you see here, panic-stricken by the spread of this disease. Bolton was confident he could handle the job. He was able to vaccinate approximately 1,300 people, almost all connected with the military and the government. He was relieved that of those 1,300 vaccinations that he administered in very short order, only one failed to take. Now, there's another side to this story, which is where those vaccines came from. And in this case, he had to make use of children. And we're going to talk more about the children aspect a little bit later. But in this case, he had to find people already afflicted with the milder form of smallpox symptoms, disease called cowpox, maybe horsepox, or vaccine disease or vaccinia, and take the poisonous matter out of those raised pustules that you saw in the photograph and insert that liquid into healthy skin in the hope that the healthy person would undergo a milder form of the disease, but at a certain moment in the display, the body's display of those pustules, you could again remove the lymph and repeat the process by jabbing it into healthy people, thus vaccination. The problem is having enough healthy children to do this and have enough vaccine material to work with, but he accomplished it. But this problem persists and a new problem begins to show up. The first problem being availability of vaccine, period, either from human or from animal sources. But also, strange things are happening when vaccination is occurring. And at the Battle of Chancellorsville, General Lee had to sideline approximately 5,000 soldiers because of strange things happening with their smallpox vaccinations. These soldiers had all been vaccinated, and yet they had exhibited manifestations of something going very wrong and the introduction of new diseases. So what was happening here? You saw at the bottom of this previous screen, soldiers inoculating themselves. Well, doctors began to take note that soldiers thought vaccination is a simple enough thing to understand and do. I could do it. I don't need a doctor. All I have to do is take out my trusty knife or bayonet and prick it into a sore of an unhealthy person, then prick myself or my buddies, and we're good. Well, it didn't quite work that way. But by 1863, 1864, there is a smallpox epidemic in the South. Not the North, as it happens, but in the South. So all the military districts within the South at this time are seeing smallpox cases. And there's, of course, a concentration among the major routes of travel, such as the Mississippi River Valley. Now, this mortality during the Civil War averaged about 28.5%, as you see here, which means approximately 1 out of every 3 persons who came down with smallpox died of it. Now, taking a closer look at what was happening in specific regiments. One private, and this is not him, but this is possibly what he looked like when he had, if he had smallpox. This soldier had been vaccinated in both arms by a physician. Why both arms, you say? For redundancy, in case one of the vaccinations didn't take, maybe the other would. So it's a security thing. And over the course of days, smallpox vaccination symptoms showed up. In other words, the mild case, not of smallpox, but of vaccine disease or vaccinia. That illustration of the arm shows a well-developed smallpox pustule at approximately day 9, day 10. There's a bit of a rose-colored areola around it. It's a pock, a fully developed pock, and the center is depressed and eventually will turn into a scab. But in this case, the photograph at the bottom shows from a real sufferer of a smallpox vaccination that went awry. It starts to ulcerate, and sores began to develop and erupt, spread down the arm and up the arm and across the chest and over the face and chest. And this was described by physicians as something pretty miserable, covered with thick, elevated scabs, and it smelled awful. Now, by this time, physicians are beginning to take note of this in a systemic way. And to take these 2 infantry regiments as an example, approximately 100 soldiers in this regiment, in one of these regiments, developed the vaccination gone wrong, with the vaccination scab perhaps developing, perhaps not, but other things happening that are not supposed to happen, erupting on the skin. Now, contact tracing begins as a result of this. They didn't use the term contact tracing, but the physicians who formed a board to begin looking into these episodes wanted to find out where the soldiers were in fact vaccinated. Was it by a physician? Was it not? In this case, the source soldier turned out to be of this description: dissolute habits, who had just returned from a furlough. Well, you can guess what dissolute habits means. So there's a possibility that this soldier who donated his own precious lymph from his sores to 100 soldiers, they all got sick with some of the same symptoms. And it turns out there was a coincident appearance of particularly syphilis, but also scurvy started to appear, gangrene, and a bacterial skin disease called erysipelas. In this Georgia infantry regiment, they counted 227 instances. And given the strength of a regiment at this time, that could have been almost half the regiment. And the physician dubbed this phenomenon spurious vaccinia, which means soldiers were vaccinated supposedly with matter that represented vaccine disease or vaccinia, which is on the same spectrum of diseases as smallpox, similar symptoms, but milder outcomes. And the idea, of course, is you'd be immune to the disease after you've been vaccinated. Was it cowpox, vaccinia? What was it? But the coincident appearance of these other diseases was termed spurious vaccinia, and this term stuck. Now, the Surgeon General of the Confederate States is this man here, Samuel Preston Moore. He was described by contemporaries as a pretty stern man, brief. He could cut subordinates down to size very quickly if they did not behave. He did not suffer fools. But then again, he had a major challenge on his hands to organize and run a medical department for a Confederate army. But he thought that physicians in the Confederate army should rise to the occasion and not only do their job healing people, but they should contribute to the medical profession and to medical knowledge. And to that end, he created the Medical and Surgical Journal. You see the cover of one of the issues. Now, it only ran for a very short time. Obviously, the war ended in 1865, but for a good year, that journal was in publication. And physicians were encouraged, actually, they were ordered to contribute observations, ideas, exchange information. It was the main organ of exchange of information among Confederate doctors. Now, mindful of these cases with smallpox or with smallpox plus these other phenomena, he designated Chimborazo Hospital in Richmond to be the receiving hospital for all cases of this kind, just regular smallpox cases or these spurious vaccinia cases, and they could be analyzed and treated in a common place. Chimborazo Hospital is located on a hill just to the east side of Richmond. You should visit. There's a park there now. It's on a hill on a bluff overlooking the James River. There is a museum run by the Park Service on that site that is dedicated to Chimborazo Hospital and gives the background of this hospital. It was the largest hospital north or south. Now, smallpox has been described, and it was described by a physician at the time as the exemplar of contagiousness. Smallpox is the most high mortality disease in human history and one of the most contagious, deadly diseases. Now, at the time, it was not possible to determine the origin of many diseases. The nature of bacteria or viruses themselves still was some years into the future, although there have been many hints available to Civil War doctors. But the idea that you would inhale effluvia from an afflicted person and get smallpox was the prevailing notion, hence the need for social distancing. They didn't use that term either, but they did say avoid breathing in other people's faces and inhaling their exhalations. Now, the terms infection, virus, and contagion are all being used during the Civil War, although virus means the presence of a specific disease, but the nature of that disease is still unknown. Of course, a virus today has a different meaning. It's a disease-causing agent that actually enters cells and replicates with the cellular DNA and extends the disease throughout the body through that method. That's, of course, still in the future for Civil War doctors. Infection simply meant having one or more diseases in your body. It didn't necessarily mean it was contagious. Contagion was also a term used for those diseases that had that proclivity to spread. Now, I don't want to confuse people, but vaccination versus inoculation. Inoculation really meant taking material from a smallpox afflicted person and taking that material out of those pustules or taking the pustules themselves when they turn to scabs and grinding that up, mixing it with water and using it to inoculate somebody else. Vaccination referred to either taking cowpox from a cow, obviously, or maybe horsepox. There were multiple poxes out there, or taking what was just simply called vaccine disease, which is apparently a hybrid, possibly of cowpox, possibly of something else. That was, in my view, smallpox light. Gave similar symptoms, but if you vaccinate with this material, the person is going to recover, doesn't have the mortality issues, and presumably will be immune. Now, for a Civil War doctor, to vaccinate somebody required that doctor to do sort of a whole physiology lifestyle appraisal. That is, the smallpox vaccine had to be, by textbook, delivered into a healthy body, not afflicted with other problems. But the doctor was required to get a holistic sense of what's going on in that body for administering any medicine, so that anything is prescribed for a specific person with specific circumstances, ranging from what job they do, their lineage, where they live, what they eat, their families like. Now, the vaccination thing originates with this man, a country doctor in England, Edward Jenner, who at the end of the 1700s came up with this insight that the pustules that looked like smallpox on the udders of cows were transferring to the hands of milkmaids who milked them. Therefore, some kind of transference from animal to humans taking place. And the women would develop symptoms that looked like smallpox, but milder. But when they recovered, they seemed to have resistance to the real target disease here, which is smallpox, hence vaccination. But even Jenner said that doctors who administer vaccine must take care. We should observe every aspect of how the disease affects the specific person, looking at the frequency of appearance of these pustules, how long they last. Apply your senses, not necessarily taste perhaps, but smell. Look at texture. You've got to feel. You've got to look and see how the pustules develop and how they modify over time until the disease has run its course. And here you see an image of a smallpox afflicted person with numerous pustules. So the cycle runs about 2 to 3 weeks. And initially, the doctor might think this is measles. Small red spots appear, but eventually they turn into this. So because this was an eruptive skin disease, Civil War doctors classified smallpox and vaccinia as eruptive skin diseases and treated them as a class. Now, the term vesicle refers to those pustules when they're still soft before they get hard and turn into scabs or crusts. Lymph is the liquid that fills those pustules until it eventually dries up and becomes the scab. But doctors had rules, and they would watch the patient up until, say, day 8, when day 8, day 9 would be ideal moments to actually pierce those pustules, take the lymph out, and thus give you vaccine from this poor afflicted person while this person's recovering. So you get essentially vaccine out of the sick person. Now, the tools used for this process could be anything, but the large tool on the left, called a phleem, is designed mostly for opening veins for venesection, but they could be used to open the skin in order to insert virus. But the smaller tools, the little lancet in the tortoiseshell cover, and then in the black and white image at left, you've got 2 lancets looking like birds flying towards the kit. That little kit is a vaccination kit designed specifically for vaccination during this era. It has 2 little lancets that you'd use for piercing pustules. One of those lancets has a sort of a goose neck on the left, and that's designed specifically to be earmarked for vaccination. There's a little inset trough, and I've got a little laser pointer if you can see it here. There's a recess here with the name of a manufacturer. In that recess sit 2 glass plates, one on top of the other. The idea is if you get some of that liquid lymph, you put it on one of those glass pieces, add some water, mix it up, and therefore you just created vaccine. And then you can take the tip of the lancet and stick it in arms of healthy people. But you only want to go mildly skin deep and not actually reach blood. And then you put the vaccine material there. Now, there's also a little compartment here that lifts out, and here you see it magnified. It's a tiny tin box. You slide the lid open, and it's here you would store scab material, which has a longer shelf life. I'm showing a few pictures of doctors here, or surgeons, as their military title is. Not because they are specific actors in my story, but they are actors in the story because they are all subject to the problems with vaccination. They all are charged with administering vaccinations, and they are all reporting the results to the Surgeon General. But to doctors, vaccination is a bit of a ritual because it involves all that observation over the course of days to know when it's a good time to actually remove that lymph from the pustules and vaccinate people, or when you leave it alone, because over time it can turn to poison and you have to back off and wait until the scabs appear, then take the scabs and crumble them up on a glass plate, mix them with water, and then voila, new vaccine. So observational skills are required here. And I should say there are 2 handouts connected with my presentation tonight, which I think are being made available to you. One is a reading list if you should wish to pursue this topic, including some hyperlinks to some online material. But there's also a flowchart that I devised that shows you the steps that are involved in the whole vaccination cycle from the point of view of the doctor. All the things that have to be observed, the medications that might be administered to ameliorate unpleasant symptoms, and so on. And you can get a picture of that matched with the actions that are taken unsupervised by doctors that lead to those spurious results. In the center, that is not actually an amputated arm. That is an exquisite wax model of an arm with smallpox pustules at about day 8 or 9. That's in the collection of the Mutter Museum. And you see more Civil War doctors looking very confident that they can handle any vaccination problem that's going to show up. Now, where did the vaccine ordinarily come from? You see here ads from the trade magazines. Notice the one at the bottom, vaccine virus from healthy white children. More on that in a moment. The vaccine ads on the left, the 3 of them that advertise vaccine, they promise a number of things. First of all, they will say they're from pristine sources, from good, healthy cows, for example. So possibly cowpox is being retrieved, since this is an animal to human interaction. It also tells you how this vaccine was stored and used. Vaccine might be used to anoint quill tips or little pieces of bone and sold as bone points or quills, so that once the incision is made in the healthy person's arm, you could simply drag that with a little moistened water to drag that through the small shallow cut in the arm in order to introduce the vaccine. And this is how it was commonly sold. But the Confederacy doesn't get to do this because, of course, the Confederate ports are blockaded and they do not have facilities to create vaccine like this on this scale. So where they get the vaccine turns out to be a big problem. And then, of course, to monitor to make sure you're not introducing those other problems. So how does Surgeon General Moore deal with this? With all those reports coming in, with doctors examining the problem, with Chimborazo being a receiving hospital, he decides that the central problem that we're having is with the doctors. They're not employing uniform, consistent procedures to vaccinate and to make sure that the vaccine they're using is pure enough for the purpose. So he puts the blame on doctors. And to remedy the problem, in the circular he issues, he says, here's what we're going to do, folks. I'm going to list exactly what you do in exactly right order, and I'm going to tell you every little step you take, such as, here's what you do with the left arm, here's what you do with the right arm. Put your fingers here, handle the lancet there. And he said, for example, we need to control this process so the lancet you use for cutting for all kinds of purposes has got to stop. Take a lancet, break off the tip a little bit to earmark that lancet as the specialized smallpox lancet and use it for nothing else. So he's introducing controls to help make this process conform to a very rigid standard to see if these other bad problems can be eliminated. But the problems continue. Unfortunately, even despite this, the biggest problem that remains is there's simply not a reliable source of vaccine. If you were in the Northern Army at this time, vaccine is being distributed directly from the Surgeon General's office, and they're monitoring it to ensure it's pure and reliable from whatever source they get it from. The South doesn't really have that luxury. So this is where the kids are going to come back into the picture. Now, Chimborazo Hospital, meanwhile, is, of course, seeing all these cases. Doctors are documenting what they see. They're forming hypotheses, but they're also following General Moore's ideas by strictly monitoring how vaccination occurs in a hospital setting. For example, a soldier might be wounded on the battlefield and taken to the hospital. Now, all soldiers are supposed to have been vaccinated. They have a mandatory immunization policy. That doesn't mean it's actually happened. So the soldier coming into the hospital might be told, you have to tell us if you've ever been vaccinated. Have you ever even had smallpox? If they've had smallpox, they probably got the scars to show it. If they haven't been vaccinated, they're vaccinated here. Even if they've been vaccinated before, they may be revaccinated. And at this time, Confederate doctors issue a certificate. It gives the date of the vaccination, it gives the name of the vaccinating physician, and that goes back to the regiment with the soldier, so that the regimental doctor on the receiving end can also keep records and monitor this problem. But a problem is emerging of a different kind. Obviously, wherever you have armies, you have civilians. Smallpox, like any other disease, is not confined to the army camp. It extends in the civilian world. Besides, anywhere that the army camps, the civilians know there's a doctor there. They have supplies. They may have supplies that we don't have access to as civilians. So civilians will show up at these camps and ask to be treated for various ailments, or to be immunized against smallpox. So it becomes a practice that civilians in the vicinity of the armies now need to be vaccinated as well if we want to maintain this disease at a minimum, both the appearance of smallpox or vaccine disease, or God forbid, we vaccinate and we run into the spurious vaccination problem all over again. So this is a complex multivariate problem that the Confederacy is trying to grapple with. Back to the children again. This advertisement calls attention to a Negro hospital that was set up during the Civil War. Two physicians are named here, Chisholm and Porcher, both of whom are very important Confederate physicians for reasons unrelated to vaccination. But where can you get reliably pure vaccine? You look to children. Children are unlikely to have acquired lots of diseases, particularly syphilis, that adults have. And you want to get these children who have been growing up in relatively isolated areas. So the South being rural, what have you got? You got plantations, lots of Black children who are healthy, and white children as well. So the Confederacy sent doctors around to plantations to take lymph from vaccinia-stricken people, inject it into the arms, or place it in within these arms, might be a better way to say it, place it in the arms of healthy Black and white children on plantations, return 2 weeks later on the assumption that vaccinia symptoms will happen, and you would come back in at the right point to harvest their sores in order to get more vaccine. So this was one of the primary means of production to get vaccine in the Confederacy. And I've never heard anybody point this out, but I wondered how many Confederate soldiers knew that when they were vaccinated, the vaccine might have originated in Black bodies. Interesting idea to think about. The public health role became more and more of a problem. Physicians, in some cases, took matters into their own hands and simply commandeered civilians in order to propagate vaccine on their own. Example, there was a Tennessee physician who kept a child in the stable, so to speak, at any given moment with smallpox at about age 8, day 8, 9, or 10, when the lymph would be at its perfect moment in order to be harvested to create vaccine. So he effectively kept an infected child at any given moment. And when that children recovered, he'd cycle another child in and kept this child in isolation in order to have his own personal source. Now, cows, of course, could have cowpox, but you have to wait for a spontaneous appearance of that in a herd in order to grab onto it. But there were some experiments that the Confederacy tried with cow herds, but they deemed none of them successful enough to create a reliable source of vaccine. So the main source of vaccine by 1864, 1865 was coming from people, mostly kids. At the war's end, Richmond burns. Richmond had its main office of the Surgeon General in Richmond, and its Confederate medical records were there. Guess what went up in smoke? The vaccine information and the records of the very phenomena that I have been talking about. So how do I know about it? It's because of this man. Joseph Jones was a graduate of University of Pennsylvania Medical School. He'd actually gone to Princeton, but he was a diehard secessionist. And when the war broke out, he went south and offered his services to the Confederacy. Now, the Confederacy did an odd thing with him. Most doctors in military service were assigned to regiments or brigades or corps. They went with the Army in the field. They set up hospitals, they set up aid stations. But Joseph Jones had a different assignment. He was a physician at large, sent directly by Surgeon General Preston Moore to investigate specific problems. And Moore assigned him to look into this problem of vaccination. So he visited hospitals, he interviewed physicians, he observed the vaccinations taking place, the ones that both worked well, as well as the ones that went awry and created the spurious phenomena. And he created a report on it. That report went up in smoke in 1865. So right after the war, he took a position here at University of Nashville Medical School. And while the memory of the war was still fresh, he decided to contact as many ex-Confederate doctors as possible and ask them to write him letters, and in those letters, say as much as they could remember about their experience with vaccination, particularly the spurious vaccination phenomena. And they did. He compiled all that information into a report, which appears here. It was a special issue of the medical school bulletin, and it's called Researches Upon Spurious Vaccination. So it is the source of information on what happened in the Confederacy with vaccination, and with vaccination going very, very wrong. Now, he also did another study at the behest of the Surgeon General, and that was to go out to Andersonville and do a report on the conditions there. And in particular, all these reports we're getting in the Northern press that they're starving prisoners, they have insufficient food, and the camp is deliberately murdering by very torturous methods the Union prisoners there. So that was a separate assignment that Joseph Jones had. While out there, he, of course, interviewed the Confederate doctors and looked at the resources available to them and also their vaccination practices. And poor Jones, against his will and to his shame, was summoned to appear as a witness in the Wirtz trial. So he gave testimony. He did say that he did not blame, his study did not show any reason to affix blame on Wirtz for the conditions at the Andersonville prisoner of war camp, and that the conditions there were really sort of beyond Wirtz's ability to handle. But he also said there's no evidence that Wirtz was directing physicians to deliberately poison Union soldiers through impure vaccine. But the suspicion about the vaccine came about because the Northern doctors were well aware of what was going on in the South. And after the war, the Northern military medical authorities got a hold of the Spurious Vaccination Report and actually incorporated its findings in the massive medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, the massive encyclopedia of everything that was learned about Civil War medicine published in the North after the Civil War. So Joseph Jones didn't help Wirtz any, didn't harm him any, perhaps, but the suspicion lingered that something did go wrong with those vaccinations at Andersonville, along with everything else that was going on in that camp. So there's some conclusions from this. Now, Jones's report concluded that the problem wasn't necessarily with doctors not paying particular strict attention to their vaccination procedures, but rather the general conditions of the war. People in the armies who needed medical attention of any kind were, in a way, disabled by virtue of the long marches, the encampments, the lack of food and water, the proximity to other diseases. So soldiers were simply debilitated bodily anyway, and that made them more susceptible to not only picking up maybe smallpox or vaccine disease, but even if vaccinated, having these other diseases show up concurrently. He didn't particularly pinpoint maybe using vaccination procedures that or tools that might have been contaminated maybe from other sources. But he did say, under no circumstances should a person with apparent other diseases be used as a source of vaccine. But this report, of course, is now entering the Confederacy when there's no more Confederacy. It's becoming known after the war, not during the war. But all the knowledge that went into this, all the observations, and by the end of the war, Confederate doctors were getting pretty canny about all of this. It did add to knowledge, it stabilized the knowledge they had and gave them a platform for post-war work. In fact, within just 10 years, human sources of vaccine disappear altogether in the United States, and it becomes cows. In fact, a particular breed known as Beaugency cows. And if the place called Marietta, Pennsylvania is not familiar to you, just know, you've heard it here, that Marietta was the world capital of smallpox vaccine production through cows up until the 1950s. It's all gone now, and there's an attempt to create a little heritage center in the little dinky place of Marietta to memorialize this. But this is what happens post-war, and these developments partially occur because, of course, these experiences during the war. But they're unresolved issues. The military control over civic life is still a big question, and it does have a tangent to, of course, today. People resisting the wearing of masks, resisting the social distancing admonitions. And one issue that always comes up in planning, of course, before these epidemics and pandemics happen, what would the emergency plans be the next time we see one of these things? the question always arises, how far does this pandemic or epidemic go before a government issues some very strict controls on people's behavior or on their movements? And for your information, the last time that was discussed and a policy announced, the idea was about 1% of the US population would have to die to an infectious disease before the government would impose very strict measures that controlled people's behavior, which means we would have to have about between 3 and 4 million people dead from a disease before the government would exercise that kind of action. So this was a big topic during the Civil War, but it never got resolved in the South, of course, because the war ended. But it's interesting that in reading the report that Jones wrote, he has some interesting observations on immediate post-war life in the South. And it kind of sheds a new light on life under Reconstruction South. White people are now getting very, very worried about Black people leaving plantations, moving to urban areas, or moving away from plantations. And this kind of movement of Black people had not been seen in the South. For white people, that meant one thing. Black people are going to be spreading disease, particularly smallpox. So there was a heightened demand for smallpox vaccine because white people who had been vaccinated wanted to get vaccinated again. And they went to physicians who, of course, did not have supplies. And by the end of 1865, in fact, there was a major smallpox outbreak in New Orleans, which became very difficult to control. So there are unresolved issues that still attach to concerns about pandemics today. Jones said this in his report. He thought, despite everything that went wrong with smallpox vaccine and the difficulty of getting reliable vaccine, this is the big promise of medicine, greatest physical boon ever bestowed on the human race. And he said he could foresee a day when in this vast globe of ours, every person could get vaccinated and eventually smallpox could be eliminated from the earth. And that finally happened in 1980. Now, the photograph you see at lower right is not a Civil War soldier, in case you were wondering that tattooed woman might have been. This is a photograph from the 1940s. It was a publicity photo where circus people showed up and got vaccinated in a very public way as an attempt to encourage more people to show up and get vaccinated against smallpox. Not quite the end of the story, though. There's a strange tangent from all this that happens to reach to the present day and to the Mutter Museum and me specifically. 2016, won't go into detail about how this happened, but remember those little vaccination kits? I showed you one of them. That's one in the Mutter Museum collection. You see here another one at the bottom. The one you saw in black and white is the one at lower right. I discovered these little vaccination kits in a drawer marked for other tools. And so these vaccination tools had little tiny labels that said vaccination on a few of them, but I recognized immediately what they were because I had been researching this issue. I'd also been looking at examples where old smallpox scabs had been showing up in the last 15 years in, of all places, American archival collections and libraries. Why libraries, you say? Because, take an example from the Virginia Historical Society, son writes to a father in the 1870s and says, by the way, we've all gotten vaccinated here, and I enclose a good scab that came off of my son. Here, you use it, Dad. Vaccinate yourself. And Virginia Historical Society put the letter and the scab on display and didn't think about it until somebody walked in, called the CDC, and the men in biohazard suits came in and took the letter and took the scab. Mindful of that story, what I discovered that particular day, I found a vaccination kit in a drawer, then I searched and found more, and I opened those little tin boxes, and what do they have in them? Scabs, 19th century scabs from the Civil War era. Well, what do I do with that? I was in touch with the Centers for Disease Control and the Pennsylvania Department of Health in very short order. They needed to confiscate the material and take it to Georgia to the CDC, which they did. We have friends there at the CDC and knew the people that had been looking at other instances of smallpox-related material showing up. So we put that all in their hands, but with the admonition that don't destroy this because this may have important information that could be recovered by DNA analysis. So we went to collaborators that we'd worked with up in Canada. Canada has a better method of analyzing material like this for DNA extraction than the CDC. In fact, fun fact, the CDC has never handled an example of a human disease that dates before 1940. So it turns out the samples that we had of something related to smallpox or vaccinia or something else in those little kits is the oldest material the CDC's ever looked at. In fact, it's the oldest material in the world that's ever been examined for possible smallpox relationships. So our friends at the DNA Center got them. We had to go through the World Health Organization to do this, to get them out of the USA from the CDC and into Canada. But fascinating story. We get some interesting results. And I'm not going to tell you those results. You're going to have to ask me after the presentation. But if you have the reading list, there's a link to an article that appeared about it because it's got a lot of press in the science news about these kits. I can tell you that enough genetic material was recovered from those kits, not just on the little scabs, but on the leftover lymph still on those glass plates in order to reconstruct 5 genomes. Therefore, DNA presented us an interesting picture of what was being used for vaccine during the Civil War. So we have a convergence of science and historical investigation here. And a big question is, what actually was used for smallpox vaccine? Was it Edward Jenner's cowpox? Was it something else? We know that horsepox may have been tried. We also know, of course, people to people, person to person, as with the children. But the idea is the target disease here is really smallpox, the big killer. Now today, pox is on a spectrum called orthopox viruses. And for a researcher, if you were going after smallpox, you would want to look along that continuum, that spectrum of pox-like diseases, and find one that's pretty distant from smallpox, that's not going to kill people and not really harm them, and use that as a vaccine. So how distant from the target virus can you get to find something that will actually work against the target vaccine? It's a question now. It's a big question for the 1800s. For all that was written about vaccine from Jenner forward in the 20th century, we haven't had any samples of actual vaccination material to examine until now. So these are questions relevant for today. How do we gauge reliability? How did vaccinia develop in the first place? And that's still a big mystery. Vaccinia or vaccine disease is still a disease of unknown origin. And cows, by the way, are not even the natural reservoir for this. So where did it start and how did it grow? So with that, I thank you. This book that appeared a couple years ago, War Matters, has an essay of mine on spurious vaccination if you're just hungry to read all this all over again. So I thank you very much. And I think we have some time for questions.
Robert, we do. Actually, but the first observation of mine is that looking at some of those photographs of smallpox victims reminded me of a speaker we had back in 2004, Jennifer Lee Carell, who wrote a book called The Speckled Monster. I don't know if you've ever read it or not, but I would highly recommend it. It's about the discovery of the vaccination of smallpox in the 1790s. Great book. So having said that, let's go to some of the questions. And the first and the obvious one is, why didn't smallpox make its way north and affect Union soldiers?
That's a good question, and nobody has a good answer for that. I think one key to this might be to think of the flu. Just as smallpox is part of a spectrum called orthopox viruses, which have similar characteristics and they're genetically linked. The flu virus is the same thing. It's an upper respiratory virus that occupies a spectrum of diseases. And so when we get a flu vaccine, it's aimed at the variant anticipated to be the most prevalent and contagious variant of the flu during a given season. Sometimes they hit it right, sometimes they're almost right. But the idea is, even if you got the flu vaccine, it's oriented to one particular strain, it might be good against other strains. And as we're learning with COVID, we've had multiple strains of COVID show up, and the vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, as a good example, seems to be good against the other variants that have appeared so far. So when smallpox was appearing in the South, it may not have been a unitary thing. There may have been variants of this that were reported as smallpox, or even reported as vaccinia or vaccine disease. Some of this happened in the North, but there were no significant outbreaks of the magnitude of what happened in the South. This was not fully realized until the war was over and Southern medical information became available to Northern doctors to the extent that it survived. There's no good answer to that question. I've never been able to find a good reasoned opinion for why that difference happened. So I'm afraid I can disappoint you. But the exciting part of that is it makes it an open-ended question for investigation. So maybe through, say, these samples of vaccine that we've got in collections or on residues on old medical tools can yield insights to help us figure this out.
Thanks, Robert. All right. By the way, for those asking, the flow chart will appear towards the end of this presentation. So they haven't seen it yet, but they will. All right. Next question. Were the Union forces also plagued by smallpox? And we kind of gone through that, but if not, and how they avoid the epidemic, and we've just learned that one too. So let's go to the next question. Did the Southern plantation owners vaccinate their slave populations in the decades prior to the Civil War?
Well, that's a real good question. That may have happened. There's not good documentation about these practices in the antebellum South, but there are anecdotal pieces that have surfaced in the literature and correspondence and so forth that slaves may have been vaccinated on so-and-so's plantation. I don't know that it was a systemic or systematic practice to do it. Certainly priority would have been given to white people on plantations. I think in most states in the South, it was pretty much up to the discretion of plantation owner. However, I'll mention this because something just came to my attention today. I read a bill that became law in North Carolina in February of 1863 that recognized the prevalence of smallpox happening in civilian populations. Of course, this is under wartime conditions. And they mandated that a doctor be assigned or identified in every county of the state who would be required to vaccinate every person. So that means enslaved or white, above a certain age, I think, above age 5, for example, I think is what the bill said. And they were to maintain a supply of vaccine, which they could get from the state attorney general, but were also expected to maintain their own supply in the manner that I described by actually taking, when they vaccinated, when the people manifested the symptoms of vaccinia to drain the pustules and save the scabs and all that. So they were expected to do that. Now, it's an interesting piece of legislation. It passed and became law, but it would have been utterly impractical because, of course, they wouldn't have had the availability of the vaccine. They wouldn't be able to produce it on their own. And of course, they're competing against the needs of the Confederate Army. So it was well-intentioned. I don't know if other states did that, but that's a good indication that they recognized everybody needed to be vaccinated. So I think, best of my knowledge, there was no uniform way of handling this throughout the southern states. I don't know what every state law might have said, or maybe they left it open and not addressed. But North Carolina, I thought it was significant enough to pass that. That's the best answer I can give you. It's an unknown. It's largely unknown.
Fascinating answer. I mean, still interesting that they did that. All right, we'll have one more question. If New Orleans had a smallpox problem in 1865, was that not a U.S. Army problem, as the city was occupied by the Army since 1862? Then, was this problem due to the influx of unhealthy Southern soldiers back from the war?
Good point. Yes, of course, the city is in Union control, but ex-Confederate physicians, one in particular, a guy named Josiah Nott, N-O-T-T, who is extremely notorious for this period because he was an advocate of a certain brand of race theory before the war that was highly influential. That is, the different races evolved separately, thus, of course, justifying treating Black people as a separate species. And he was in the thick of trying to deal with smallpox cases. Union physicians during that outbreak in New Orleans cooperated with civilian and ex-Confederate physicians to try to get at this problem and contain it and bring it down. So whatever resources the North had for vaccine was brought in, but the epidemic started before they may have even had an opportunity to undertake a mass vaccination program. That's an interesting question that's largely explored. How often did Union occupying forces try to administer a public health program, and how successful was it, and did they vaccinate? I have read virtually no literature on this, and I think this is an interesting question to explore. I think there were some other pieces to your question. Certainly, Confederate soldiers returning home are bringing illnesses. and this happened with returning Northern soldiers as well. You figure that soldiers from rural environments that are brought into a military camp, they're sharing tents, maybe 5 to 7 soldiers per tent. So whatever they've got in their bodies and that's communicable is going to be exchanged with their mess mates, their tent mates. And it could be a problem in camp. And of course, smallpox takes off that way too. So these soldiers coming back are certainly harbingers of disease. They are debilitated. They've been on poor diets for a very long time. So again, you have a multidimensional problem. Doctors at the time could sort out these issues. They knew that the returning soldiers would be a problem. They knew that smallpox was showing up because it had been endemic in the Mississippi River Valley anyway, and had recurrent bouts of appearance. Plus, now they're occupying public health as part of their responsibility anyway. Think of during the occupation earlier, Beast Butler, General Butler, and the sort of martial law of public health that he exercised in that town and was much caricatured and criticized for some of the things he did.
All right, thank you for that. And that will be our last question, Robert. So, and unfortunately, my camera decided not to work. You can hear me, but you can't see me, which is probably better for all of you anyway. But
I can see you.
Okay, beats me then. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. And Robert, thank you very much for what was a whole new aspect of the Civil War I knew nothing about, and it was fascinating. So thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us. And
thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
No, it's our pleasure, and hopefully, I'm sure we'll have you back. This wasn't your first time, and it won't be your last. So stay well. All right. I'm going to break into some commercials, if you will, for our next programs. We have a public affairs program coming up on June the 9th called The Future of Schools, and it will feature Lenny McAllister, the CEO of the Pennsylvania Coalition of Charter Schools. Oh, how'd that happen? Alrighty. And Donna Cooper, who is the Executive Director of Public Citizens, the Director of Public Citizens for Children and Youth, and they will debate the issues of the future of public schools. So that, and by the way, that will be our first in-person program post-pandemic, but again, with limited attendance based on city restrictions and things like that. And then our other program in June will be a Civil War Roundtable, and it will be on June the 28th, but it will be at Union League National down at the Jersey Shore, because the subject is the Union League and Generals Meade, Grant, and Sherman. And for those of you who don't know, National has 3 9-hole courses on it, if you will, and they are named after those 3 Union generals, Meade, Grant, and Sherman. And the speakers will be the dynamic duo from the Legacy Foundation, John Miko and Jim Mundy. So join us at Union League National, if you will, both in person and also virtually at the same time. So once again, thank you all for joining us for another, I think, fascinating, look at an aspect of the Civil War that is new to all of us. So we'll see you June the 9th, and in between, everybody enjoy the world as it opens up a little bit. So thank you all. Stay well and take care. Bye now.